my father came from Japan in 1905. He was 15 when he immigrated from Japan. He worked until he was able to actually build a store.
Let me tell you a story in the form of a dream. I don't know why I have to tell it, but I know what it means. Close your eyes, just picture the scene as I paint it for you. It was World War II when this man named Kenji woke up. Ken was not a soldier. He was just a man with a family who owned a store in LA. That day, he crawled out of bed like he always did, bacon and eggs with wife and kids. He lived on the second floor of a little store he ran. He moved to LA from Japan, they called him immigrant. In Japanese, he'd say he was called Issei. That meant first generation in the United States, when everybody was afraid of the Germans, afraid of the Japs, but most of all afraid of a homeland attack. And that morning, when Ken went out on the doormat,
the bombing of Pearl Harbor initiated America into entering World War II, changing the course of history forever. Pearl Harbor was a devastating attack on U.S. soil. Although we had 4 previous warnings, we did not take any precautions, and it still caught us completely by surprise.
An aerial attack, I didn't see that coming.
The Japanese ambassador sent a letter to D.C. The problem is D.C. couldn't decode it quick enough to warn the harbor. By the time they could warn the harbor, the attack had already started. Japan sent over a small 2-man submarine into the harbor, but the U.S. troops sank the submarine before it got into the harbor, saving countless lives. Put your seatbelt on, Adam. So Japan sent in the spy plane. They wanted to see what was going on in the harbor. The spy plane did a couple laps that Sunday morning. Some people saw it, but they just kind of ignored it, thinking it was a training exercise. That was our 3rd warning. Our 4th and final warning, radar scanners picked up multiple large blips. We just ignored it because we figured it was too big to be anything. We figured it was reflections from the sea or something. This happened just minutes before the bombing started. This caused us thousands of lives at the end. Those were the 4 warnings we had before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now we're going to switch over to Cam to find out what was happening during the harbor. Did you buckle up like I told you to, Adam?
Americans were extremely confused by what was going on at first. Hey, what's up, Adam?
What's up?
At first, they thought it was just a normal flyover by the Americans, but it ended up finding out that it was an actual attack by the Japanese warfare. After they figured out what was going on, they did what they were taught to do. They ran to their battle stations as quickly as they could, and they tried to fight back. But after numerous planes attacking their ship, it was just too much, and they were overran. After some ships were directly hit by torpedoes and kamikaze-like warfare, the ships and the men inside of them began to sink. Some made it out with minor burns and scrapes, others weren't so lucky. Remember to buckle up, Adam. The 2 most memorable ships that sank that day were the Arizona and Oklahoma. The Arizona was directly hit by a torpedo, splitting it in half, killing everybody on board, including 3 sets of brothers. The Oklahoma capsized, but not everyone died. People survived for over a week inside the ship after it sank, but couldn't get out because the steel was too thick. This was the end of the Arizona. Now that I've told you about what happened during the attack, we're going to pass it on to Skylar to see how the U.S. responded after. Remember to buckle up, Adam and Skylar.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Franklin D. Roosevelt responded by declaring war on the Japanese, so entering the U.S. involvement in World War II. President Franklin Roosevelt quickly decided that America could not fight the major campaigns in the Pacific and Europe at the same time. He and his advisors decided to fight first the Germans and the Italians. Then, when victory in Europe seemed sure, the United States would turn to fight the Japanese in Asia. This left the Japanese free to extend their power throughout Asia and the West Pacific. Soon after the attack on Hawaii, the Japanese forces invaded Hong Kong, Malaysia, and the Philippines. American land and air forces in the Philippines were destroyed and captured. The Japanese forces seemed too strong to win by just a regular military victory while they were fighting Europe. President Roosevelt decided that they would use the Manhattan Project nuclear bombs to destroy Hiroshima, which was the primary target for the first atomic bomb mission. The mission went smoothly in every respect. The weather was good and the crew and the equipment functioned perfectly. In every detail, the attack was carried out exactly as planned. The bomb performed exactly as was expected. The bomb exploded over Hiroshima at 8:15 in the morning, August 6, 1945. About an hour previously, the Japanese early warning radar had detected approach of an American aircraft headed towards the southern part of Japan. An alert had been given and radio broadcasts had stopped in many cities, among them Hiroshima. The planes approached the coast at very high altitude. At nearly 8 a.m., the radar operator in Hiroshima determined that the number of planes coming was very small, probably no more than 3. The air raid was rifted. The normal radio broadcast warning was given to the people that it might take shelter if there were B-29s actually sighted, but no raid was expected. The bomb exploded with a blinding flash in the sky. A great rush of air and a loud rumble of noise extended for miles around the city. A fire blast was soon followed by the sounds of falling buildings and growing fires. A great cloud of dust and smoke began to cast a pile of darkness over the city. Military headquarters repeatedly tried to call Army's control station in Hiroshima. The complete silence from the city puzzled the men at the headquarters. They knew that no enemy raid could have occurred. They knew that there was no sizable store of explosives in Hiroshima at the time. A staff officer went to the airport and took off from the southwest. After flying for about 3 hours, while still nearly 100 miles from Hiroshima, he and his pilot saw a great cloud of smoke from the bomb. That bright afternoon, the remains of Hiroshima were burning. Tokyo's first knowledge of what really caused the disaster came from the White House public announcement in Washington 16 hours after Hiroshima had been hit by the atomic bomb. They had just figured out that they were hit with an atomic bomb. When the Japanese refused to surrender, President Roosevelt ordered another atomic strike on Nagasaki. On the morning of August 9, 1995, at about 7:50 Japanese time, an air raid alert was sounded in Nagasaki, but the all-clear signal was given at 8:30 when only 2 B-29s Super Fortresses were sighted at 10:53, and the Japanese apparently assumed that the planes were only on recon and no further alarm was given. A few months later, at 11 o'clock, the observation of B-29 dropped instruments attached with 3 parachutes at 11:02, and the other plane released the atomic bomb. The 2 primary targets in the bombing of Nagasaki were the Mitsubishi Ukraine Abundance Works, which is a torpedo place, and then Mitsubishi Steel and Arms. It wasn't apparent by trained observers visiting the 2 Japanese cities which of the 2 bombs were most effective. In some respects, Hiroshima looked worse than Nagasaki. The fire damage in Hiroshima was much more complete. The center of the city was hit by, and everything but reinforced concrete buildings were virtually disappeared. A desert was clear swept. Charred remains and only a few strong buildings' frames were left standing from the terrifying sight. At Nagasaki, there were no buildings just underneath the center of the explosion. Everything around was remotely okay. The damage to the Mitsubishi Arms Works and the torpedo works was spectacular, but not overwhelming. After the 2 attacks on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the Japanese finally surrendered, so ending World War II. Now we'll switch it over to Adam so he can tell you the Japanese side of the story.
The Japanese perspective for the events at Pearl Harbor are much different than the Americans' perspective. Let's talk about that. Niwa tori ga bakiyatsu shimasu. This means the chicken exploded in Japanese. It has nothing to do with Pearl Harbor, it just sounded awesome. Because Japan had a bay that perfectly resembled Pearl Harbor, the plan was perfectly executed. Plenty of people died and a bunch of damage was done to the US, but it was not a complete victory for Japan. One of the main reasons for attacking Pearl Harbor was so they could blow up our aircraft carriers, which unfortunately for the Japanese were not in the harbor that morning, and because of this, the Japanese canceled the planned second attack on the harbor. Because of the events that happened that day, the United States joined World War II and basically kicked Japan's butt. According to WND.com, it would have been wiser for them to surpass Pearl Harbor and take over the European colonial empire. That way, they would have avoided the war with the United States. By doing that, the Japanese could have simultaneously attacked Russia with Germany and avoided a war with the United States and Great Britain. Shoulda, coulda, woulda.
Damn country, what for? The time passed in the prison town. He wondered if he'd live it down if and when they were free. The only way out was joining the army and supposedly.
Meow.